Good morning, everybody. I'm standing here mentally composing my letters to Mr. Bernard Hogan Howe about the way he helped you get here. But welcome, everybody, and thank you for coming. This speech is going to take, the lecture is going to take about 45 minutes, so it's going to be quite long, so get sitting comfortably. We'll leave about 15 minutes at the end for questions, which I think will be important. It's been over 43 years since Britain joined the European Economic Community. For all that time, there have been calls for Europe to reform, for Europe to be more democratic, more functional, more competitive, and for Britain to lead that reform. The result, if anything, Europe has become less democratic, less competitive, and more dysfunctional, and Britain has become more sidelined. The EU has been in decline for some time now. There's no change of course in sight, and the risks involved in staying in are clear for all to see. Low growth, high unemployment, and waning influence. In 1975, the EU was the bright future, a vision of a better world. Now it's a crumbling relic from a gloomy past, and we must raise our eyes to the wider world. The UK has been a persistent advocate of reforming and modernising the European Union. Even a decade ago, there was a hope of radical reform as the Union expanded from 15 nations to 28. Some thought the new members, only recently independent themselves, would shift the EU away from the centralising statist destination and towards a more democratic and more trade-focused direction. The hope was that Europe would be wider, not deeper. With hindsight, this now looks ridiculous. The siren calls for more Europe have only become wider, louder, noisier. The UK also proselytised for a two-tier or two-speed Europe, with a loose decentralised group around a more centralised Franco-German core. With the Eurozone, we now have a de facto two-tier Europe, but one that works to the detriment of the non-Eurozone countries. Centred on Germany, the European Union's largest and most powerful nation, and the paymaster of Europe, the Eurozone constitutes a dominant majority. Now, this is downright dangerous. The core Eurozone countries will not accept any curtailment of decisions they need to make to save the euro. At the same time, the non-Eurozone countries cannot accept decisions that are against their interests, imposed on them by the Eurozone core. It will only lead to conflict, a conflict that can only be prevented by veto procedures that should be unacceptable to both sides. Economic growth on the continent has ground to a halt. Since the turn of the century, the EU has grown at a third of the rate of the global average, and the Eurozone has grown even more slowly than that. Europe's share of global GDP is falling, as is its share of global trade, and this trend will continue. When we last voted on our membership in 1975, trade with Europe was the vast majority of our total trade. This has fallen since then, and in 2008, the UK started to trade more with the rest of the world than with Europe. The fact is that for us, Europe is becoming less and less important. The euro, of course, has become a destroyer of jobs. Unemployment across the continent is running almost 10%, youth unemployment 20%. Greece and Spain are suffering from youth unemployment rates of nearly 50%, and Italy almost 40%. Unemployment is destroying the prospects of a whole generation of young Europeans. So the euro is an experiment that's failed. In its short life, it's already responsible for sovereign debt crises in several European countries, high unemployment, and dramatic trade imbalances across the Eurozone. But then the European project is a litany of failures, from economic catastrophe, collapsing single currency experiment, a poor record in increasing trade, and the damage done by merging home affairs, to the undoubted foreign policy failures. Then there's the Schengen zone. The passportless travel area that was once held up as a pinnacle of European integration is crumbling before our eyes. The migration crisis has brought more than 1 million refugees to Europe's shores, with many more expected to come, is a stake in the heart of the borderless Europe. Now, the strength of any policy can only be judged by how it copes with crisis. Schengen, just like the euro, is failing under pressure. So the problems facing the EU are mounting up. Economic stagnation, high debt, high unemployment, high regulation, ineffective foreign policy, and failing internal policies. This is the backdrop of the government's renegotiation of our terms of membership. Now, the government has four strands of its renegotiation. Economic governance, ensuring the union operates for the benefit of all 28 members. Competitiveness and a target to cut the regulatory burden for business. Sovereignty and an opt-out for Britain from ever closer union. And finally, immigration and the proposed so-called emergency brake. This renegotiation is a once-in-a-generation opportunity. Unfortunately, the government has spent this opportunity on demands that are so unambitious as to be a waste of time. The concessions outlined by the Prime Minister on Tuesday will have little, if any, impact on the nature of the EU. They will do almost nothing to address the very issues that the government itself has identified. Take immigration. 265,000 people migrated to the UK from the EU in the last year, many of them from poorer Eastern European countries. Such high levels of migration are to be expected because of the enormous wage differentials across Europe. There are 6 European Union members where the average wage is less than a third of the UK's minimum wage, and a further 8 countries where it's less than half. Given such incentives, it's surprising that more people are not making the journey. This has consistently been a top issue for voters in the UK for a decade. The government's answer? That an emergency brake system be put in place that would allow member states to partly deny in-work benefits to new arrivals for up to 4 years. But of course the big caveat is that it would be necessary to prove that services are under strain and secure the approval of a majority of other EU states. It's rumoured that a French negotiator told his British counterpart that they were, and I quote, happy to give the British anything they wanted, so long as it was nothing of substance. He must have had the emergency brake in mind when he said it. When you look at the figures, it is clear that even should the measure be introduced, the emergency brake will have no impact whatsoever. This is for 2 reasons. The first is that very few EU arrivals claim in-work benefits in their first 4 years. In the first and second year after arrival, only 10% of European Union nationals claim tax credits. And it only gets to 20% by the 4th year. This is because half of migrants from the continent are single and childless. A further quarter are not single, but they're also childless. This means that 3/4 of migrants will only be eligible for very low levels of in-work benefits. By the time the referendum takes place, a single earner without children on the minimum wage will be entitled to less than £10 a month in tax benefits. Not even with the most generous leap of imagination can anyone believe that the loss of this amount would dissuade people from coming to this country. The other problem with the brake is the government's own policy is to dramatically raise the minimum wage in the form of a national living wage, which will have the effect of effectively abolishing in-work benefits. By 2020, when the living wage is due to be £9 an hour and the personal tax allowance has risen further, in-work benefits will be minimal. And the minimum wage in this country will be an even greater multiple of the average wage of the poorest EU members. The government has said that no calculation has been done on how much the proposed brake will cut EU immigration. It's hardly surprising, because the number will be very close to 0. That's why I've said this is an emergency brake that would not stop a push bike. Then there's the matter of parliamentary sovereignty. Now, the primary reason I believe that Britain should vote for Brexit is not economic. It's actually political. It's so the United Kingdom, the first great liberal democracy of the modern era, the 5th largest economy in the world, can recover control of her own destiny. This renegotiation does not call for any repatriation of powers. It offers no confirmation of Parliament's sovereignty. All the government has demanded is an exemption from ever closer union, and the government's proposed red card system to block unwanted laws. Now, given the ratchet nature of European Union, the exemption from ever closer union is not worth the paper it's written on, and the red card proposal is worth even less. The red card system only operates on draft laws, only works if there is a subsidiarity argument, and it needs the agreement of 55% of EU Parliament. It's very much the same as the old yellow card system, which William Hague dismissed as too difficult to satisfy. Just think about it for a second. Think about the arithmetic. A blocking minority in the European Council is 35%. If you get 35%, you can stop anything. Right? If 35% cannot be achieved, it's inconceivable there'll be simultaneous rebellions in 15 European parliaments on the same issue. The red card is not, on any interpretation, a parliamentary veto. It returns no power to Parliament, it does not help us protect our national interests, and it offers no protection from European lawmakers. On the government's call for greater competitiveness, there's not been a single year in the last 25 when European Council meetings haven't concluded with a rallying cry to cut regulation and increase competitiveness. And they promptly did the opposite. Year after year, regulatory burden increases and Europe's competitiveness declines. No specific regulations have been identified, no pro-competitive measures have been unveiled. President Tusk's almost detailless commitment to greater competitiveness will be no different from all the other false promises. In summary, the government's renegotiation boils down to a few vague measures that either won't have any effect or will change so little as to be not worth the effort. The most common reaction from the press and the public seems to be, is that it? We have squandered our only opportunity to gain any meaningful reform from Europe. Given the disastrous direction of Europe, its 40-year-long, inexorable and irreversible trend to more centralisation, and the lack of meaningful change, in my view, the safest option now for us is to leave Europe. It's not just that exit from Europe is nothing to fear. For Britain to remain as a member of the European Union would be to bind us to an institution that's creating a slew of unnecessary risks. It would be to forego control of our own destiny and to give up on real opportunities to improve the lot of our own people. So given the safe course is to leave, it's vital we set out how we will leave and what sort of relationship we can expect once we do. Now, there are some who are nervous of laying out in detail how we see it playing out, some of my allies, if you like, on the outside of this debate. I am not nervous of it. This is the biggest question we will face in a generation. It's actually our democratic duty to make the consequences clear. The options are very good ones, and you cannot beat something with nothing, even if that something is the creaking edifice that is the European Union. Now, in 2006, Professor Patrick Minford assessed that the net effect of the European Union on costs and competitiveness was so detrimental that departure from it was likely to prove beneficial, even if all the government managed to negotiate in Brexit was World Trade Organization terms of trade. In other words, the minimum legally possible. At that time, I thought that was a very optimistic view of Brexit, but that was before I took a hard look at the numbers. The starting point in this is to ask what benefits we actually derive from our membership of the European Union. Trade, investment, access to global markets. It's long been claimed that the membership of the EU increases trade and with it wealth and welfare among its members. Well, let's just assess how accurate that is. Now, understanding and explaining trade movements is difficult. It can be disrupted by bank crises, oil shocks, global disruptions like the collapse of the Soviet Empire, new members joining the community, new competitors, and so on. The best way to assess whether we got an advantage from entering Europe is to compare our export performance into Europe with those who are a comparable group of competitors who are not in Europe. Now, fortunately for us, the exercise has actually been done by a man called Michael Burridge, an academic scientist actually, in an exercise for the Civitas think tank. He took the European export performance of the UK and measured it against the European export performances of a group consisting of America, Australia, Canada, Iceland, Japan, Norway, Switzerland. Modern, stable competitors. Now, the three graphs I'm going to show you show this performance in three distinct periods. Before entry into the European Union, after entry into what you might think of as the common market period, and then in what you might think of as the single market period. Now, given that the stated intention of the single market was to improve on the trading performance of the common market, you'd expect each of the performance in each of the graphs to improve. The actual facts are illuminating, and this next graph will start you on it. The black is the OECD group, and red is us. And as you can see, for most of the 60s, we performed poorly against about half as well, in fact, in terms of export growth as our competitors. The last couple of years, we suddenly woke up as we're about to enter the European Union, and we saw some improvement in exports. The next graph shows what you might term the common market period, and right enough, we do pretty well. We significantly outperform our OECD competitors into that market. You would expect that picture to be repeated in the next graph. It's the most telling one. In the single market period, our exports grew, if anything, slower than our OECD competitors, despite our membership of the European Union. Remember, this is exports into the European Union by our competitors. Now, during the single market period, despite all the costs incurred, despite all the treaties signed, despite the regulations implemented, despite all the controversies we undertook to get it through, our performance in selling to Europe was worse than our competitors outside the EU. And why is this? Well, there are actually two possible reasons. One is that the burden of the single market bureaucracy handicapped us against our competitors so much that it penalised us. It's almost certainly true to some extent. But the far bigger reason is that during the common market period, there were high external tariffs around Europe. Trade tariffs during the 80s and 90s were far higher than they are today, before they were reduced by the World Trade Organization and its predecessor GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Our success in the 80s and early 90s was a result of being inside a trade protectionist barrier and little else. That is now largely gone, and we are now at a disadvantage to our global competitors. That shows you the last part of the reduction of tariffs by the Uruguay round. So that doesn't work anymore. Our competitive advantage into Europe doesn't work anymore. So what else could we get? Well, the other direct benefit, another benefit we supposedly derive from our membership, is increased foreign direct investment in our economy. Now, it's certainly true that at the beginning of the common market period, that time when we saw growth in exports, there was a spike in foreign investment in this country. No doubt that happened. That happened under the first entry. But since the barriers have come down, we have received far less foreign investment than either Norway or Switzerland, both outside the EU, even if we account for every possible advantage they have. The top graph is the investment per capita. The second graph, the dotted line below it, is if you take out Norway's oil and gas investment, because you might think that's an unfair advantage. And the third one is if you also take out all of Switzerland's financial inward investment. So we take out all the advantages of the other two players outside this marketplace, and we are still worse off than them. So there's been no discernible benefit to trade or to direct investment. Now, the final supposed benefit of our membership, and you hear it all the time from the pro-European, or the Europhile group, if you like, is how the EU increases our influence on the world stage, increases our clout, allowing us to secure more favourable terms and more favourable outcomes across the world, in particular, more favourable trade terms. We can test how well that clout has served our interest if we look at the EU's performance on trade agreements. When negotiating trade agreements with other countries, the EU has to balance the interests of the 28 different member states. This has had dire consequences for the United Kingdom. To start with, trade agreements negotiated by the EU take a very long time to conclude. We still don't have free trade agreements with China, India, or the US. The talks with India have been going for almost a decade. Our interests are not well represented in trade negotiations. The majority of free trade agreements have been successfully negotiated by the EU are with North African or South American countries, and with far more historical links to Mediterranean countries than to us. The only Commonwealth country to enjoy a free trade agreement with the EU so far is South Africa, and that's more to do with Nelson Mandela than the UK's clout. Other than that, the first will be Canada, which is just pending. Now, this is all a function of how marginalised Britain's interests are within the EU. It's no surprise we've been outvoted in the Council more than twice as often as any other country. The consequence of this is that these trade deals are not tailored to our requirements. And much has been made, by the way, of how hard it would be for a single country like ourselves to negotiate successful trade deals on its own. This is nonsense. If we compare the EU's trade deals to those that Switzerland has negotiated, with its small population and limited global influence, then we see something interesting. On the left, you've got a table showing the Swiss free trade agreements, on the right, European free trade agreements. And what you're seeing, the two columns show you, is the change in growth rate of exports to those countries. On the left-hand side, obviously Switzerland to Jordan, Tunisia, Mexico, and so on. On the right-hand side, Britain's improvement in export performance. For the Swiss own negotiated, they got better performance. All the yellow numbers are improvements in performance over what went before. So the Jordan, it was a 4% growth rate, then 27%. Tunisia, 6%, 26%, and so on. For us, only in a small minority, a third of the trade arrangements, did we see an improvement. Syria, that's very helpful, to 9%. Tunisia from 7 to 9%, and so on. In other words, this so-called clout, this so-called heft, is no use at all. Switzerland's seen an increase in 2/3 of its free trade agreements, and big increases too. And the UK only in a third. So little Switzerland, with a population of 8 million, is able to negotiate better, faster trade deals for itself than the European Union does on our behalf. Does anyone seriously believe that the 5th largest economy in the world would not be able to negotiate by itself at least as successfully as Switzerland? And just as damning, is that the majority of these EU trade agreements do not even include services. Services account for over 3/4 of all the UK's economic activity. They have provided much of our economic growth in the recent years, as well as most new employment. Our creative industries, our financial services, our legal services, some of the best in the world. It seems certain that they would be included in any trade deal negotiated by the United Kingdom. So on trade, on investment, on access to overseas markets, the benefits we have supposedly derived from the EU are far less than commonly understood. They may well, these days, be negative. So as I said, I was initially doubtful of Professor Minford's assessment we'd be at the bottom, better off outside the EU, irrespective of the EU's response. But it now looks as though it's right. And those business groups such as Goldman Sachs and the CBI, who have warned of catastrophe should we leave, are almost certainly wrong. Now, it's not surprising that these businesses are making the argument to stay in. At the end of the day, these businesses are arguing for their very own, very narrow self-interest. Indeed, frankly, just as an aside, I would raise an eyebrow at the tremendous concern these companies are showing for our national welfare, given that 6 of the CBI's biggest members don't actually pay any corporation tax at all in this country. So, but nevertheless, we should pay attention to their concerns. They have huge sunk costs in distribution and supply networks in Europe, and worry about losing access to existing EU markets. Well, whilst they're not job creators or particularly good innovators, they still represent an important component of our economy. This shows you, by the way, that they're much worse these days than small businesses are at providing jobs. Well, those businesses can relax. There is no doubt that access will continue in the event of British exit. No one can reasonably say the UK would cease to have access to European markets. The worst case scenario is the UK would revert to trade on a World Trade Organization basis, with tariffs imposed on our exports to the EU. And you can see them here. Now, I want you for a second to ignore the top one, which is cars, 10% tariff, and food and beverages, which is 20% tariff. The others are sort of 1 to 4.5%. All of those almost certainly will be negotiated to 0, but even if they weren't, that is not a crippling percentage. But if Europe wants to stick to trading on a World Trade Organization basis, they will be in an incredibly very badly positioned to do so. Everyone knows the balance of trade is in Europe's favour. as you see here, and it's dramatically worsening from our point of view, improving from their point of view. We currently import 59 billion more from Europe than we export. After Brexit, we'll be Europe's biggest export market, worth 289 billion. That's about £4,000 for every man, woman and child in the country. Now, to see our importance to Europe, however, and take it out of the sort of numbers factor, you only need to walk down the street. More than a quarter of all cars sold in this country are Mercedes, BMWs or Volkswagens. About 16 billion of them a year, billion euros of them a year. And those are just some of the German brands. We are Europe's second largest and fastest growing car market. This negotiation will be primarily about politics, and our European colleagues preeminently concerned about their national interest. I promise you, I've been there, that's what they do. They are past masters of protecting their own national interest. We are too valuable a market for Europe to shut off. Within minutes of a vote for Brexit, the chief executives of Mercedes, BMW, Volkswagen and Audi will be knocking down Angela Merkel's door, demanding there be no barriers to German access to the British market, a 16 billion market. And while they're at it, by the way, they'll also be demanding that the British companies that they own will have uninterrupted access to Europe. And we're talking about Mini and Rolls-Royce, both owned by BMW, Bentley, owned by Volkswagen, Vauxhall, owned by Opel, and so on. Premium brands with healthy demand across Europe. And it's not just German cars. Same will happen with Shell and Unilever in the Netherlands, EDF, EADS, and the wine and cheese industry of France, Seat in Spain, Fiat and the fashion designers of Italy. The pressure from European companies and their trade unions and their employees for a free trade deal with the UK and the remaining members of the European Union will be huge. We have far more to gain from this exercise than we have to lose, and the opposite is true for the European Union. People have spoken wrongly about 3.3 million British jobs being linked to our membership of the EU. Well, there are over 5 million jobs on the continent that are linked to trade with Britain, and I owe my friend Dan Hannam the credit for the idea behind this Dad's Army diagram, which I lifted from his Twitter account. But it shows you very, very clearly that 1 million jobs in Germany, in the German car industry. France, wine and cheese, 500,000 jobs. Spain, 420,000 jobs. And remember, Spain cannot afford to lose any jobs at the moment. Italy, in a similar position, 300,000 jobs in fashion and associated industries. To put it bluntly, the most powerful country in Europe, Germany, needs this negotiation to succeed to the tune of 1 million jobs on cars alone. The second most powerful, France, needs it to the tune of 500,000 jobs on wine and cheese alone. The first few months after Brexit will probably be hysterical, dominated by hysterical threats. But the leaders of France, Germany, Spain, Italy, Poland and the rest know that the way to lose elections is to destroy your own industries. And that is a very powerful advantage for us. Then there are the absolute benefits that Britain would gain from Brexit. Our food imports will be about 6% cheaper outside the common external tariff. We're free to reduce our regulatory burden, making our business more competitive. We'll be able to negotiate our own trade deals, opening up new markets. And then there is the city. The apparent conventional wisdom seems to be the city will be damaged should we leave the EU. This is extremely unlikely. It would be perfectly possible to negotiate proper protection for any significant areas at risk. But there are two obvious examples where the city might gain. TTIP, the upcoming or ongoing EU-US trade deal, looks likely to exclude financial services due to a tiff between the American and French film industries, who can't agree, and American concerns about having to recognise some rather dodgy European banks. Now, any UK-US deal would not omit one of the UK's most important sectors. And they wouldn't have problems of recognition here, since most of our banks are at least partly American. Then there is the financial transaction tax within Europe. Within the EU, we would face a circumstance where French bonds sold in the city would have to have tax charged on them and then remitted to the French treasury. Not if we're outside. Outside the EU, the city would be free to continue as before, such as trading in euro-denominated bonds, free of that, whilst ensuring it is free of the threat of an FTT, as well as being free of all other stifling European legislation. And just remember this. Any action against the city by the European Union would effectively have to be action against Wall Street and Hong Kong as well, which would be too stupid for words. In total, it's easy to see Britain will be better off out, even on World Trade Organization terms, and that's the worst case scenario, which actually won't happen, almost impossible to happen. So what should we do? What's the scenario for our negotiation? Well, some people have suggested we should look to Norway or to Switzerland to see what terms we can expect once we have left. Well, the idea that we should fit our future to some Procrustean bed cut to size for smaller countries is nonsense. And I'll walk you through why. I mean, the conventional options are laid out here, the Norwegian, the Swiss, the Turkish options, and our aims and what probably the outcome will be. But in terms, the first one, EEA membership, often called the Norway option, works well for Norway, actually, but it's not appropriate for a major power like the UK. It's sometimes pejoratively called government by fax. That was actually a slogan used in a campaign in Norway to try and get them to join the EU. The disparity is exaggerated. Norway sits on 200 EU committees designing the technocratic rules that are handed out from there. Half its financial contributions are voluntary, and many of the EU regulations are actually pretty much copied down, almost by fax, from other international organisations on which Norway sits and we don't. So the representation of the Norwegian position is exaggerated. However, as it stands, the model wouldn't work for us. To make it viable, it needs an arbitration court, not the ECJ, and a dispute resolution procedure and some representation procedure. It could be done, it could be negotiated, but it'll take more than 2 years. So it's not really an option for us. The Swiss option, EFTA membership plus a host of bilateral treaties, is the best starting place and is informative in many ways. But it's not, as it stands, perfect for us, because it includes free movement of people, and we cannot have that. Indeed, there's a clash looming on that after a Swiss referendum on precisely that subject. So that's where we would start, but understand the comparative negotiating position again. Switzerland, when it dealt with this, is a small country surrounded by the EU. Its trade is absolutely dominated by the EU. Over 62% of its exports go to Europe, and it's got a large trade surplus, normally a good thing, but in this negotiation a bad thing. And it's not big enough to be a critical market for any EU country. The negotiation between the EU and Switzerland, I was there, took place in the 90s and was marked by some serious hostility after it rejected the European Union membership, and yet it still struck a good deal. The optimum for us would be similar, but without the free movement of peoples. That would not be on the table. Essentially, we'd be looking for a full-scale free trade agreement. And just, by the way, it's just been done with another country. If you want a model of how this would work, go on the European Union website and look at the European description of the Canadian Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement that has just been agreed. It's not yet in place yet. It eliminates all customs duties, which the EU website excitedly describes as worth 470 million a year to EU businesses. That is 1/5 of the savings on such a deal on the car industry in Europe alone. 1/5 of the savings they make there. So this will be a perfectly good starting point for our discussions with the Commission. At the same time, these negotiations are going on, however, and I'm very confident we get them concluded inside 2 years. At the same time the negotiations are going on, Britain would need to do something else. It need to undertake a massive programme of simultaneous negotiations to negotiate free trade agreements with target countries that will be key to a more global approach. Now, if you read as many assessments of Brexit as I have, you can easily come to the conclusion that all sides of the argument are exaggerated. I'm certain that the catastrophic predictions of the Europhiles are simply nonsense. And that's why Toyota, Nissan, Airbus, BMW, Opel, Volkswagen have all now said that Brexit won't change their investment plans in the United Kingdom. In some cases, they've reversed their line to say that, and that's despite government pressure. Indeed, David Cameron was having breakfast with the head of Toyota yesterday or the day before, so I expect there'll be more pressure there too. But they've all said they're still going to stick with us. On the pro-Brexit side, of course, there are a range of estimates from modestly to dramatically better off. Now, in my view, the difference between these estimates depends mostly upon exactly how we use the freedom that we get, the freedom to steer our country and maximise its opportunities for free trade. And if we grab those opportunities with both hands, that's how we'll get the best outcome for Britain. And it means immediately seeking free trade agreements for the biggest prospective markets as fast as possible. There is no reason why many of these cannot be achieved within 2 years. We can pick up the almost complete agreement between EU and Canada straight away, and if anything, liberalise it. We can accelerate our component of the TTIP deal with the USA and include financial services. Diverting our current contributions to the EU will help us with this process, by the way, because what we have to do is firstly carry out the negotiation and achieve a deal, and then do things to maximise the benefit of that deal. One of the things, just as an aside, and it's not a big issue, but it's an important issue in one sense. We will actually have to use a significant chunk of the money, if not all of the money, that we save from sorry, not all the money. We'll have to use a significant chunk of the money we save from our contribution, the money that's recycled, that comes back from our gross contribution, to continue subsidising, for example, the agricultural industry and other components of our economy, because if we actually do have a free trade policy and cheap food, it needs dealing with. But the last point I want to make on the question of exploiting free trade is this. The underperforming part of the UK economy when it comes to exports are small businesses. There's a very good reason for that. Small businesses don't have big export departments, big sales departments, big international trade departments, etc. The sorts of things I used to have when I was at Tate & Lyle. So we have to somehow facilitate that. They're our fastest, most creative, most innovative, fastest job creators, and so on. So what I would suggest we do is use 1 billion of the 9 billion or so that we would save net from the EU, use 1 billion of that to create a new Board of Trade. And I'm not just talking about a new job for Michael Heseltine. I'm talking about actually a new Board of Trade designed to maximise the exports we will drive into the global market. Dedicated to helping British businesses create new links to countries with which we achieve these trade deals. And to give you an example of it so you can visualise it, the funding will be available to set up an office in every single major commercial centre in the world. Staffed, completely separate, by the way, from the Foreign Office. You literally cannot let the Foreign Office do this. They will be hopeless at it. It will be staffed with bilingual experts who know the language, the customs, the regulations, are on hand to help British businesses develop links to the country. Imagine for a second an 0800 number and an email address where a small manufacturer in Lancashire can call Shanghai or Mumbai or Sao Paulo and find out in English how to negotiate the import regulations, how to find a freight forwarder, how to hire a warehouse locally, translate a brochure, the simple things that stop too many small businesses from operating abroad. They may be small companies, but this is not small beer. I'm talking £1 billion project here, £1 billion a year project here. That will take those free trade agreements and actually make them alive. It will derive our most creative sectors to use the free trade agreement, something that we've never done historically. We must see Brexit as a great opportunity to refocus our economy on global rather than regional trade. This is an opportunity to renew our strong relationships with the Commonwealth and Anglosphere countries. We forget our greatest weapon. You know, the English language is the dominant language of the media, if you include American English. It's the dominant language of the internet. It's the dominant language of science. It's the dominant language of international law. There's a reason why all the Russian oligarchs come and sort out their rows in the British courts. It's because they're seen as fair. And the English language and the things that go with it are formidable competitive advantages around the world. And of course we share history, culture, as well as language. We have family ties. We even share similar legal systems. The usual barriers to trade in many countries of the world are largely absent. Now, the Prime Minister has repeatedly stated we are a trading nation with global horizons. It's undoubtedly true, but it's time we unshackled ourselves and began to focus policy on trading with a wider world rather than just within Europe. And while we're at it, we'd have the opportunity to reform our economy, pushing through the changes necessary to create a dynamic, modern economy, competitive tax rates, a competitive labour market, effective rather than burdensome regulation. And after Brexit, we can put all that through without asking Brussels permission. The European Union was a noble vision. It was born out of Europe's history, a history of war, conflict, tyranny, and destruction. 2 world wars ripped Western Europe apart, 3 if you count the Franco-Prussian one. It's an entirely understandable, indeed an admirable response to such horror, to want to break down national barriers and increase bonds between peoples and countries. Add to that Spain emerged from Franco's tyranny, Portugal from Catano, Greece shook off the rule of the colonels, and after the Berlin Wall fell, whole swathes of Eastern Europe rediscovered democracy and liberty in Europe. Now, faced with such a history, it's entirely understandable that the European Union came into being. It's a profoundly peaceful project dedicated to protecting democracy across Europe. But this history is not our history. Britain has its own proud tradition of fighting tyranny, of promoting and protecting liberty and democracy, both at home and abroad. For us, Europe has always been about trade. For the continent, it's about much more. This does not mean that either side is wrong. But the European project is not right for us. The global project is. Thank you. Right, shall we take questions? I haven't put you all to sleep. Yes, sir.
Could we go back, Rob Hunt from Bloomberg, could we go back to the slide where you had what our negotiating aims would be?
Yeah, sure.
Can
we get that? Can we get back there? Right. One of the technicians get back there. Yeah.
The key one on this, well, 2 interesting ones. The out case, as it's made to the public, is that we shouldn't have to pay into the EU budget, and that we shouldn't have free movement of people. Now, you think we'd still end up paying into the EU budget?
Well, there are 3 components. Yeah, we may. There are 3 components. The first one is that it's about 18 billion gross, 9 billion net, varies from year to year. The reason for the difference is obviously there are some repayments back into agriculture and so on. They would, certainly if we went a free trade route in agriculture and food, they would have to be maintained. Indeed, they might even get slightly bigger for agriculture in order to protect the agricultural industry. We are helped by the fact that the direction of travel in agricultural subsidy policy has been less towards subsidising production and more towards subsidising looking after the countryside and such things. So that would have to be still paid, although not to Europe. It'll be our own, and as a result, it'll be more efficient. By the way, I mean it's not for nothing that the European auditors never ever clear the European accounts. So there's that. The other area where we may, if you look at what Norway does, Norway pays about half the money that Norway pays is required and half is voluntary projects it wants to do. And I can see areas where we might voluntarily be involved, international development areas and things like that. But it will be nothing like, I mean, we're talking about a 9 billion net position, and you'll be a couple of billion off that at most.
And the other one, I mean, free movement.
Bearing in mind, this all comes back to the negotiating leave.
Yeah, but you're possibly as soon as June, you're going to be making a pitch to the British people, and the pitch as offered by, say, Nigel Farage is we should stop paying money to Brussels, and you're saying, might be a little more complicated than that.
Well, I'm trying to give you a proper answer.
Well, I know, but and free movement of people, Norway has it, Switzerland has it, you think we won't?
Switzerland has it for the moment, but you are not, no government, if Brexit is voted for by the British people, migration will be a significant element of the argument that takes place. No government could seriously go to Europe with a free movement of people's agenda. It simply wouldn't work. and they know that. And of course, they can demand it from Norway, they can demand it from Switzerland. They will not be able to demand it from us. Just people keep forgetting. I mean, the inferiority complex that the Britain seems to have on these matters infuriates me. I mean, the simple is we're the 5th biggest economy in the world. We are their biggest market. They need us. And they won't like it. Don't get me wrong, there'll be lots and lots of rows and arguments about it. But we will not be conceding that. We will be controlling our own immigration. It's one of the things that's fundamental about this, and it's an exemplar, really, of the lack of control of your own government. And that's why it will not go. Absolutely certain of it. So I'm not saying there won't be a single immigrant coming here. We will make the decision ourselves.
So what would be the things that we would be prepared to give up if you're doing this negotiation, say in our aims?
Well, this is not an application for jobs. Well, firstly, as you well know, if I were doing the negotiation, I categorically refuse to answer that question because you wouldn't do it that way. But there's very little you have to give up. The simple truth is, this is a negotiation. If you're buying a house or a car and you go in and the other guy is going to make more out of it than you are, you have one negotiating lever. If you can walk away and he can't, you have another negotiating lever. We have both in this case. So I don't think we need to talk about concessions at all, in truth. I'm just being excessively reasonable.
Well, I don't think our services...
Next question, sorry. Yeah.
If it's such a no-brainer, why do you think that most of the political class aren't grabbing this opportunity for the British people? And equally, if they do vote to leave, do you think the leadership of the institutions we have at the moment are the right ones to get the sort of deal that you're talking about?
Well, the answer to the first question is that there have been historically benefits. I can't remember when you came in, Adam, if you were there for the common market period, the common market period was clearly beneficial to us. And there's no doubt about it, both in terms of investment and in terms of the increase in our share in European markets. What's happened since has not been that obvious. I mean, bear in mind, Margaret Thatcher signed up to the single market project because she thought it was an extension of the common market project. It turns out it's not. It's a bureaucratic harmonisation and deepening of control project, not a real free market project. So if she was fooled, I can forgive quite a lot of other people being fooled by it too. Secondly, there's a lot of vested interest in this. You know, the Foreign Office gives advice on this. When I was Europe Minister, my entire European Union department were all Europhiles. There was a good reason for it. They all wanted to go and be ambassadors in Europe. They didn't want to upset their future customers, or they were going to go and work in a commission of largely tax-free income of enormous size and terrific career. So there's also that built in. If you really want to look at it in detail, this is an exercise in internal vested interest in all these organisations. In terms of how it's negotiated, actually, to be honest with you, Adam, I don't really think this is that hard a negotiation because the levers are so strong one way. As I say, I'm not seeking return to government. If I were, this would be the job I want, because actually it's a very, very straightforward one. It requires a certain amount of willingness to not blink, but no more than that. Yeah?
Hi, John Price from The Guardian. If we vote to go out but the Scots want to stay, would you be...
Who wants to stay?
The Scots.
The
Scotland.
Scots.
Should they get another independence referendum?
Well, firstly, Alex Salmond et al. Said that this was a once-in-a-generation thought. There is a view, some of the Scot Nats themselves hold it, that a Brexit decision would be very pro-Brexit in England and not pro-Brexit in Scotland. I don't think there's any evidence of that at all, actually. Secondly, in the event that we did leave, the route back is quite tricky, and I think the Scots are very canny. I wouldn't, you know, I'm a great. My wife is a Scot. I was married in the Church of Scotland. You know, I'm treated with admiration, and they're very canny, and they would see that this is a project which, for the reason I've described, is pretty unstable. And one of the downsides, and I do mean a downside, of Brexit is it would slightly destabilise the remaining EU for a while Finland thought what it was going to do, and Denmark and Sweden thought what it was going to do. But so I don't think it would be very, very good time for them to put that question to Scott. Yes.
David, just two quick questions. Is what you're saying here, would it take Britain back to what we originally joined in the common market before the European single market was introduced in the mid-80s? So are you saying we're going to turn the clock back to the original deal which we all agreed to?
No, it's before then. I mean, the original common market doesn't exist anymore because you haven't got the big tariff barrier on it. It only really exists, ironically, in cars and agriculture. You know. And on cars, we'd have to have a free market deal, which is why Canada is actually quite indicative, because there's almost no limits in the Canadian one. And on agriculture, frankly, we're better off out, really. So there is no common market left. If they still had a big external tariff barrier, this argument would be much harder. I mean, actually, I approve of the tariff barrier coming down, which is good for free trade generally. But it would be a much harder argument to make.
So
bear in mind, I've arrived at this conclusion after 20 years of being wrong, basically, 20 years of thinking we can fix this, we can fix this, we can fix this. But I think it was Einstein who said, you know, those who keep doing the same thing and expecting a different result is a definition of insanity, and that's really the position the British establishment is in now.
Thank you. And second, what's your view of ministers and politicians of your friends in the party who have spent years telling us how they hate the European Union, and yet they're not going to stand up and fight the Union? What's your view?
People have got to deal with their own consciences on the about this. You know, I don't hate the European Union. The reason I finished on the note I finished on is that I think, you know, when I was there in the Council of Ministers, you know, dealing with Spaniards who could remember Franco, dealing with Portuguese who could remember Catano, you know, dealing with the Greeks who just escaped the colonels, I admired what they wanted out of it. It was just different to what we want. They have a different legal system. You know, you've got the Napoleonic legal system and so on. It's just different. And we have tried and we have tried and we have tried to make this work. And every single time it fails. And this is not us giving up at the first attempt. This is us giving up at the 15th attempt. And treating them with respect, I think. Somebody right at the back there. Sorry, I can't.
Yeah, Ian from IB Times. I'm just in your closing pitch. You were saying a competitive labour market. Does that mean less workers' rights? And interestingly, the last time you referenced Franco, to my mind, was in relation to the trade unions bill. Don't you think it'd be worse for left-leaning people outside of the EU, where the government won't be confined to EU labour laws?
The key, as your reference to my previous noisy intervention on Franco will indicate, I am a strong believer in trade union rights. I'm inclined to almost to give you an advert of an upcoming book of mine, but I won't. Because I believe justice demands 2 views of the workforce. But it should be our decision on that. You know, it shouldn't be Brussels' decision. It shouldn't be a decision designed to meet the interests of the Greeks and the Germans and the Swedes and so on. It should be designed to meet the interests of our own country with our own traditions. And that's the point. And the difficulty, if you take the argument I've made on free trade agreements work very, very badly for the European Union because they compromise 28 different ways. And the same is true with regulation. If you design a regulation to do one narrow thing, it can be quite light touch, it can be quite low cost. If you try and do it 28 different things with it, it's almost always going to be very expensive. And that's the problem with regulation from Europe. Yes, sir.
Hi, Tom Peck from the Independent. One thing, I'm slightly mesmerised by the Dad's Army.
It is wonderful, isn't it?
Right.
I shall send Dan Hannam your comments.
If there's 421,000 Spaniards making 740 million worth of fruit for Brits, that's like 1,100 euros worth.
No, I think that's the total exposure. It's not actually. Yeah.
Deeply misleading. But the main point is like the comparisons with Turkey, Switzerland and Norway and so on. They're difficult comparisons to make because if Britain, then they were never large, prominent members of the EU who then voted to leave. And in our negotiation, the idea that we could get similar terms to them. Do you not have to bear in mind that the EU, in the incidence of Brexit, would have to consider in their negotiations with us that any favourable terms that were given to us would motivate Dutch people who want to leave the EU, all the rest of the European Union, and they would be forced to treat us in punitive terms. And in fact,
yeah. Well, the time to deal with that problem was before this negotiation we've just gone through. What will happen and you mustn't sort of assume there's sort of some supranational brain that's guiding this. I mean, you just go and have a look sometime at the history of where all the commissioners came from. Mostly they're failed politicians from other countries. Ours used to be Neil Kinnock. Actually, we've got a very good one now, but you know, we'd send people who had not done terribly well to Europe, and everybody else does the same thing. But at the end of the day, when it comes down to a stress decision, and you can see it actually with the migration problems now, when it comes down to a stress decision, leaders, the council of ministers, make decisions on the basis of their own national political dynamic. And the point I'm making here is what people haven't. You know, people turn and say, "Oh, well, you know, this is only 5% European trade or something, or 5% European GDP." Yes, but it's focused in areas which have got incredibly high leverage in the political orbits of the most important people. Merkel cannot allow the German currency to lose its market here or to be heavily disadvantaged, and the same gets repeated elsewhere. So you're right. There is an argument the other way, but that's why they should have been much more generous and much more sensible, and we should have been much more ambitious in the negotiation that's just happened, or just nearly concluded. Once you get to the point that the British people have said no, then that's it. You've got to make a deal, and it'd be a very interesting problem, because if they made a sort of world trade only deal, then we would have to go a world trade free market route. We would become that would actually end up as a sort of Hong Kong route. We'd be the most ferocious competitor on their doorstep. So there are downsides to doing that too. You know, you really don't want a complete free trade market on your doorstep without any protection. Yeah.
Liam Halligan. David, you're a former Minister for Europe, massively experienced, former Tory leadership candidate. You've thought about these issues very deeply, and whatever anyone thinks, you've clearly put a lot of work into this speech today. What are you personally going to do during the Brexit referendum campaign? And how do you feel when the press keeps writing that your side of the argument lacks a real political heavyweight to lead it? Why aren't you pushing yourself forward to lead that campaign?
Well, the two elements there. Let me answer the second first. Right, the Tory party has always been schismatic. You know, I think trying to lead that is really a sort of, you'd waste a lot of time on that when we've got 3 months basically to make an argument. Right. This is the first of a number of speeches and lectures I'm going to give. Forgive me for it being 45 minutes, but this is not an issue that you can deal with very simply, and unless you're willing just to live with the sort of throwaway slogans of either side. And from that point of view, that's really not worth doing. Let me tell you what I think the decision's going to be about for ordinary citizens of the United Kingdom, because it answers your question. They won't be worrying about 3 million jobs. They'll be worrying about one job, their own, or their husbands or wives, or their sons or daughters, you know. And that's what matters. And one of the things I'm going to be doing is going around the country to every single regional sector. I'm going to Nottingham and saying this is what I'm going to do for the lace industry, going to West Midlands saying this is what I'm going to do for machine tools or cars, going to the Northwest and talking about textiles and West Yorkshire. And say, this is the deal we'll strike in your area. This is what it'll look like. And this is why we're able to do it. Because in 1975, you remember the vote switched in 1 year from 60-40 one way to 60-40 the other way. And it switched off the back of a campaign that was based on nothing but fear and a monolithic establishment attack on the nervousness of the British people. Right? And I don't think that's the right way for this decision to be made. This is a point of inflection in Britain's history. It is a time when we will make decisions which will influence several generations ahead. It'll have implications for the stability of Europe. Good ones, I think, in the longer run. It'll be wobbly in the short term, but good ones in the long run. And so I think the decision should be made on rational grounds. And that's what I've tried to do here as best we can. And what we'll continue to do on a much more localised basis so that people actually understand what it means for them. Most people will vote for their self-interest. That's a very good thing. I believe in that. I believe in democracies that work that way. That's why I believe in markets. And I think if we make the argument plainly and we're honest about the arguments, you know, I mean, I was being taken on by Bloomberg for saying, well, we might have to concede this. Yeah, we might. You know, it's a negotiation. You know, then if we do that, I think there's a fairly significant chance that the Brits will decide to go the global route rather than the regional route, which is the way I think about it. Yes, sir.
Thanks, Christian from ITV. You're one of the few people on your side of the argument who have articulated what Brexit should look like.
Yeah.
So not Sweden, not Switzerland, potentially something like Canada. Why has no one else actually put that stake in?
I can't speak. Yeah.
If it's not going to be you, and I think you've basically answered no, you're not going to lead it to Liam's question. Who should it be? Can it be Boris? Should it be Boris? Will it be Boris or someone?
Well, I didn't answer. I forgot to answer the second.
I think you said no.
Yeah, I forgot to answer a bit of Liam's question, which is
Blinded by the question.
I was blinded by the question. Yeah, I don't think it matters actually. I mean, I know for the Westminster Village, you want to write, you want a picture and you want to write a bit about personalities and so on. That makes writing about it easy.
Come on,
Eh?
it doesn't matter.
But
For my mum, she doesn't listen to me, of course. It will depend on who's leading it, who's on the telly.
Yeah, well, I don't agree. I think what matters will be the decision. Decision. He's already given me her number. Actually, his mum likes me, but the simple truth is they'll make the decision. I mean, you mustn't underestimate the British public. Out there beyond the M25, they're not stupid, and they don't necessarily believe all of what you say. In fact, they believe less than half of what you say, I'm afraid. That's what the numbers tell us. They will look hard at what is happening to their own future, their own job, their own environment, and they'll also get irritated about other things. I mean, there'll be big arguments about migration. I'm not going to get much into that, to be honest, but there'll be big arguments about that. So they'll make the decisions on what matters to them. And they won't be taking guidance from Boris, or guidance from Theresa May, or guidance from David Cameron, They will be making a decision saying, I think this is right, I think that's stupid, I don't think it's a good idea. Yesterday, was it, I've forgotten which channel carried it, there was a survey of what the putative negotiation has just sort of concluded will do to people's decision, right? Now, if you take the sort of Führer principle that you've been throwing at me, then they would have all gone with David Cameron and said, well, that makes us more likely to go. In fact, something like 44% of them said it's more likely to make me vote against, and 19% in favour. The argument matters. We should believe the argument matters. It's a democracy. The argument matters more than the person. Anyway.
75 was all about everybody didn't want to be part of the Foot Pal Alliance, right? I'm old enough to remember that. People didn't want to vote for the no camp because the only people talking for the no camp.
No, I don't think that's right. I don't think that's true. I think it was the 3 million. I think the thing that moved 1975 was 3 million jobs would be at risk, and the trade unionists said it, and the CBI said it, and the government said it, and I'm afraid all the newspapers said it, and so people believed it. There was no proper counter argument. It's the proper and in this day and age, this is not the sort of old-fashioned, centralised, single source of information world that was in existence then. It's a multi-source world. I mean, a good chunk of the information will come through social media and God knows what else. Yes, sir.
David, did you answer the question about why no one else is making the case for what Brexit?
Oh, sorry. Yes, it's a very good point. I can't answer for everybody, but at least one of them has said to me, "Oh, we don't want to put up a case; it'll only get knocked down." Now, I don't believe that. I think it'll be complicated. As this is a complicated case in some ways. I mean, it took 45 minutes to present the case, of which 20 minutes was the case. It's complicated, but I think it's very robust. I think it's an incredibly powerful case. But people are nervous about this. They don't want to be the person who loses the argument on telly, basically. I think what it comes down to. And I think that's just silly. I think this is a powerful case. The facts support it. Nobody's been exposed. These facts have been around. I mean, almost none of these tables are mine. I've taken them from IEA and Civitas and Open Europe and even frankly some European Union documentation. I tell you, getting the European Union external tariff numbers out of the Commission is harder than getting Vladimir Putin's mistress's phone number. I tell you, I've tried. So there we are. Yeah, sorry. I missed that.
You're going to go around the country and have many conversations with lace manufacturers and carpenters, as you said. 4 months isn't really long enough, and I presume June the 23rd.
Well, I hope I'm not the only one doing it.
I assume the out campaign would like longer for this, and the best way to do that is to get Labour wife a vegetarian kofta and asking him to listen to his heart over this. And just also a second question, if I may. Do you think there will be one referendum? The Prime Minister said there is one chance, but if the country votes out, do you think Europe will suddenly decide it can be generous after all?
Too late. Will I be taking? The last time I went anywhere with Jeremy Corbyn, we got the last Brit out of Guantanamo Bay. So it's got a good track record. But that was Washington. But I do think it's too short in a way. I was a signatory to the SNP stroke. I don't know how many people signed up to it. Motion saying we should do it later. Because it's a complex element, I think it needs to be a proper debate. It's a rather short time, but I don't think it's an impossibly short time. I don't think it's. I mean, I'm not a subscriber to the view that this is a battle that can't be won. There are some on my side of the argument who think that. So I'm certainly not one. Did I answer? Was there another question in there? Sorry.
I'd like to know about the Guantanamo Bay trip.
Ask me later. It was to Washington. We didn't go to Guantanamo Bay, otherwise I might not be here today. Yeah.
Michael Deacon, Telegraph. Aside from all the other possible benefits of Brexit, does it give you revenge over David Cameron?
What? This is much more important than any. Frankly, actually, it's the most important issue of the generation. I think it is actually a possible an opportunity to change the direction of history. I mean, in politics, the proper motivation is you want to change history for the better. You know, it's not about having a chauffeur-driven Mondeo or whatever it is that they drive around in the ministers' cars now. It's about changing history for the better, and that's what I think we could do with this. So.
Can you read Guido Fawkes? So are you expecting a call from number 10 offering you a knighthood to campaign to remain in?
A knighthood? My dear boy, I'm a privy councillor. People like me are supposed to turn down knighthoods. Next question. Quentin.
Is this a bigger fight though? I mean, you're presenting a very academic case,
yeah.
But is the public going to be recoiling? Is it going to be rebelling against the clerical class, against the political class as a whole? Is there a bit of that, the sort of sans-culotte feel?
There will be. There will undoubtedly be a bit of that. I mean, one of the I'm now hypothesising, but one of the reasons I think for the sort of slight tension between the two main proponents and the candidates for designation is they take a different view of this, of the right strategy. Huh? The Leave versus Vote Leave versus Leave.eu. I think the Leave.eu is more sans-culotte, and the Vote Leave is more establishment. But you know, there's at least 3.8 million would-be sans-culotte out there.
But that's a legitimate.
That's perfectly legitimate. You know, look, I mean, the whole world has been dominated by these types of movements, partly because of what the European Union itself has done. I mean, the euro was the biggest economic self-inflicted wound since the gold standard. You know? And it created a sans-culotte movement within Europe, let alone outside it, and given us an exemplar of what actually, you know, we like to talk about anti-democratic, or this is not sufficiently democratic. What really demonstrated that, crystallised that for me, was the treatment of Greece by Brussels, in effect, by the European Union, in which people were dying because hospitals were being closed, because the suicide rate went up, starvation in some parts of Greece, for heaven's sake. I mean, that's a demonstration of what provokes an sort of democratic uprising. And so there will be a component of that. It won't be as big here, because we don't do it. You know, we didn't have a revolution in 1848 or the rest of it so much, but and our country is more stable. But nevertheless, there'll be a few million of those. Yeah.
James Slack from the Daily Mail. I think I know the answer to this from what you said about social-driven Mondeos, but you sort of famously resigned from your post on a point of principle. Would you be saying to your colleagues that they really ought to be on an issue of this size, be prepared to put career advancement ahead of where they might end up in future cabinet?
those things are acutely personal decisions. You know, I'm not in the business of telling people what their consciences should tell them. You know, that's their call. You know, I also, you know, as I said before about personality, I don't think it makes that big a difference. You know, at some point, I am sure that Ian Duncan Smith and Chris Grayling, maybe one or two others, will say, you know, maybe John Whittingdale, whatever, I don't know, will say publicly. I think the Prime Minister is wrong to constrain them. In the first place, I mean, he tried it. I mean, his first, I forgot what it was now. He was abroad, and he said that they were not going to be able to say what they wanted to say. And the next morning, on the 10 to 8 on the Today programme, I argued the opposite. And 9:10, they changed the policy when they realised it was unmanageable. But the government will use every weapon in its power to stack this game in its own direction. We must live with that thing, and I'm not going to suggest somebody burns their career to make a very, very, very fractional change in the likely outcome. I think it's it's a rather good test of Liam Halligan's point, whether it's right or not, is, you know, would a single member of the cabinet coming out early change the course of this referendum? I don't think so. So if it wouldn't change it, if I thought that one of them leaping out and saying, right, this is ridiculous, this is a bad negotiation or bad policy or bad proposition, and we should vote to leave, and I thought that would move it by 10 points, I'd give you a different answer, but it won't. I think I am due in a television studio, so my apologies for going on so long, but it's an important issue, biggest issue I think of the age, and I think it was worth the time. So thank you very much for coming.